So welcome everybody again, and what I'd like to do is start by explaining about return on investment and why it's important for guiding decisions. I'm going to describe 10 common pitfalls that most ROI determinations encounter and unfortunately render those ROIs very often wrong, illusory, and in many cases counterproductive. And part of the problem is that people tend not to be aware of those weaknesses. Then I want to introduce to you what I feel is a right, reliable, and responsible way to develop what I call real ROI that overcomes the pitfalls. And we're going to describe with regard to the two important concepts and techniques, the tool called the problem pyramid, and the concept of real business requirements. So return on investment is the quantification of return, which is the benefits that you get relative to the investment costs of achieving those benefits. Some kind of a course of action, and the benefit is measured by comparing what happens with the proposed course of action to what would happen if you just kept doing things as you always had, business as usual, the no change. There are two common measures that are identified. One of them is the payback period, and that tells you when your cumulative benefits exceed your cumulative cost, and we'll see that in a second graphically. And the term ROI ordinarily refers to a percentage return. And because it's an annual percentage return, it can be compared with returns from alternative ways to invest your money. So if you were to put the same investment money into a bank savings account that's insured and relatively risk-free, you probably wouldn't be getting as high a return as you would with a more risky, for instance, project, but that's part of the decision making. ROI, return on investment, is the language of business. Whether or not it's done consciously or explicitly, ultimately business wants to get more back than it spends. So return on investment considers both the costs and the benefits. And the payback period shows this very simply. When you start some kind of a project or activity, usually there's a period of time where you're investing fairly heavily perhaps, and then that tapers off, and then over time as your activity, as your project begins to lose steam, you have to start investing again to maintain it and update it and so forth. In contrast, the benefits usually take some period of time to start occurring. Often that's the implementation period while you're spending money, while you're spending costs, and then the benefits tend to start increasing, and then they start tapering off as whatever you're doing loses steam. The point at which the benefits, the accumulated benefits exceed the accumulated costs is the payback period. And most organizations are looking for very short payback periods. The other common approach, and the one that's actually most commonly referred to as ROI, is an annual percentage, and as we said, then it can be compared to other investments. And it's the percentage of the average annual benefit over the investment cost. Okay? This travels under a variety of names, and many organizations, as I was kind of alluding to a minute ago, have what they call a hurdle rate. And that's the return rate that a proposed project needs to accomplish in order for the added risk of the project to be considered acceptable for the organization. When we calculate return on investment, we ordinarily use a discounted cash flow. The discounted cash flow says for a given scenario, and one scenario is no change or business as usual, and then for each proposed alternative scenario, you might be comparing different ways of achieving your desired results. Then you identify the specific sources of revenue, the specific expenses or costs, and you play them out year by year. You net each year the net annual benefit, the revenues minus the expenses. Okay? And you factor in then what's called the discount factor. The discount factor takes into account what's called the time value of money. I'm just using for an example here 10%. And what that says is that if I give you $1,000 today, and you promise to give it back to me a year from today, and indeed you give me that $1,000 back a year from today, if factors such as inflation, say, were at 10%, getting that $1,000 back a year from today would actually be worth only $909. Now, the value of the discount factor is that when we multiply the net annual benefit times the discount factor for that time period, it gives us what's called the net present value, which is in today's dollars. You often see references to that in the news with regard to the economy. And then because each of the yearly net annual benefits has been turned into today's dollars, you can simply add it across, in this instance, 5 years expected useful life, and that gives you a single number that you can use to compare one scenario to another. And that's really the key for determining, is this approach more desirable than making no change? Is there a benefit? So who needs ROI? Well, frankly, everybody needs to know the ROI, and certainly everybody needs to produce it. Decision makers need to know it in order to develop and carry out strategies and tactics, choosing appropriate methodologies. They use ROI determinations or estimations to determine lines of business, product service offerings. And what most of us are probably most familiar with is determining whether or not to initiate a project. People who are buying things need to know whether their purchase is going to pay off. People who are selling things need to know that same information because their buyers want reliable value information. Project managers need to know ROI because they need to make sure that they indeed are delivering value. And the other stakeholders on a project need to know this because they're concerned about achieving value, whether they're the recipients or the ones delivering it. So all of these players need to know ROI. Many organizations have formal requirements for calculating ROI, but usually only at limited points within a project, typically at the very beginning. The fact is, you need to know the ROI before you get into something, and you need to know the ROI that you're actually getting, and you need to be able to tell at the end whether you have achieved what you expected. Okay? So this is what we use to tell whether our operational activities are in fact worthwhile, how worthwhile, and it's a way for us to manage risk. If you're a project manager or familiar with project